Okay, so I'm going to go through some general aims. Then I'm going to give some overviews of different types of tools and texts and explain what my focus is going to be today. Then the bulk of the session is really going to be around three topics. Talking about qualitative recording, then a brief discussion about other qualitative data, i.e. if you're not dealing with the sort of standard assumption that most tools and texts make, which is around the fact that you're interviewing someone and you've got textual data. And then I'm going to talk through how to approach qualitative analysis in a very broad sense, and then give you some ideas of what I would suggest that you do next. So in terms of the scope and the aims, so I'm really focusing on the issues that you need to think about when you're deciding what to use and how you might use it in your research. As I've said, I'm really focusing on the sort of recording and analysis type tools and tech. This is not a how-to session. This is not a hands-on session where I am going to spend a huge amount of time telling you how, for example, to code a transcript in NVivo. That would require much more time than we have today. And the one thing I would say is there is a lot of training around that does that sort of how-to approach. And as I will say at the end, I would definitely recommend that if you are going to go down a path of using a particular tool, that you look into that specific training. A lot of this, well, all of this draws on my personal experience, both in terms of using the tools and supervising doctoral students using the tools. I would not in any way describe myself as an expert, particularly on what used to be called computer-aided qualitative data analysis software, and now is often abbreviated just to QDAS. I am not someone who has, I've undertaken training myself, but I'm not someone who is like a trainer in how to use these tools, which is why I will continually say I really strongly recommend taking some training yourself if you plan to use that. And as I say, I've allowed plenty of time. I always say I've done this, and then I probably usually haven't, but today I've really tried to allow plenty of time for you to answer some questions. So I'm just going to have a look and see what has been put in the chat so I can have a quick look. Okay, AI, interest in AI. I will touch on AI. This is obviously an interesting and emerging area. And at the end of the session, I've pulled together, as best I could, a pretty recent reading list that has started to touch on the issues of AI. I would say that in terms of qualitative research discussions about AI, they're really only starting. And there is, as I guess with AI more broadly, you'll probably find that researchers fall into two camps: the sort of gung-ho, enthusiastic, let's get going camp, and the slightly more cautious, let's have a think about this camp. And I would put myself very much in the latter camp, particularly around ethical issues. And I'll talk a bit more about those later. Okay, yeah, scale is something that we will definitely touch on in terms of if you're dealing with a lot of data. My first experience of using NVivo was on my own PhD research, and I did a year-long ethnography in a investment bank with hundreds and hundreds of bits of data, recordings, group recordings, documents. And so So yeah, for me, at that point, that the dealing with the scale of stuff was very much one of the reasons that I initially started to use NVivo as a tool. Being more efficient, Brianna. I think you're very efficient. I think we might struggle with that one. I'm talking more about interviews and focus groups, but we will remind me as we get through, and I will make sure to talk on focus groups because there are more challenges when it comes to particularly transcription of focus groups and how tools can help. Yeah, Sarah, talking about AI, we will definitely discuss that. And yes, you're right, Christina Silvers, who I think was that, sorry, I don't know whether they are still, useful on NVivo. And on the reference list at the end, I've also got a couple of links through to the National Centre for Research Methods, which if you're in the UK and haven't come across, I would really strongly recommend that you look at their resources, and I've put through a couple of links. They have actually started, I did find a couple of things on AI on their website, so that was useful. Okay, user-friendly will be one of the challenges, I think. That is often one of the big critiques of quite a lot of the certainly the analysis software, is that historically it hasn't been hugely user-friendly and required quite a lot of time and energy to put into it before you could actually feel like you were getting somewhere with it. This is one of the reasons that when I'm supervising a master's project or anything that's a year long, I quite often don't necessarily encourage students to look towards some of the tools and technologies, because if you're doing a research project that's got sort of 15, 20 interviews, by the time you've invested the time in some of these tools, it would have been quicker to do it other ways. But as the amount of data that you have goes up, so there is a bit more of a balancing act to weigh up, I think, in terms of how we really approach it. So that's really useful to get. Thank you very much for putting those in the chat, and hopefully we will at least touch on those as we go through. But as I say, please do stop, unmute and say, what about, as we go through, to make sure that I can address your specific concerns as much as I can through this process. Okay. So in terms of the overview, what I wanted to start by saying is that it's important to think that there's a whole range of tools and technology that you can use in your PhD. And we're not, or I'm not going to try and cover everything. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about research, we get so focused on trying to find things that are very specific to our particular needs that we perhaps sometimes forget to look down the pyramid here and to think about what else it is that you might be able to use. And certainly as other software has sort of developed, even using Excel and Word has now become much more practical and much more useful in terms of what you can do with those general productivity tools and tech in terms of analysis. So don't rule out, going back to some old favorites and looking at how you can use those. One of the things that I will say several times, I imagine, is that when, particularly for those of you that are doing doctoral research, we do so much reading around the topic of the research and perhaps relatively less reading around the methodological aspects of the research. And so it is useful to read other people's PhD theses, other papers and accounts of how people have done their research, particularly reflexive accounts, and see how the tools and technologies get mentioned in those accounts. And that can give you some insight into the sort of things that people will use. So generally, at the bottom here, I'm talking about all the basic stuff that we use, but also thinking about social media and other things that we might use in the means of sort of communicating our research and even accessing data. And then, of course, when you look at general research tools and texts, referencing software is often the big one that gets debated. And in referencing software, you will now find incredibly useful ways of organising your note-taking and your thoughts about the literature in ways that were, that historically some people have used tools like NVivo to do. For example, I used NVivo as a means of note-taking and organising my literature when I did my PhD. But now I'm not sure I would do that because so many of the referencing software have better inbuilt tools for that sort of thing, as do other note-taking that sort of be at the bottom pyramid. Questionnaire software, really important to think about, particularly the compatibility between different tools here and potentially the data analytic tools that you might or might not want to use. So we tend to think of questionnaires as only being quantitative, but they don't have to be. And questionnaire software can also be used for things like diaries. Diary prompts are often run via questionnaire software. And so it is important to think about those compatibility issues. Always check for all of these things, this is true, always check what your institutional access is. Because often for the general research tools and texts, you will find free versions, but the free versions are nearly always feature limited. And increasingly, and I'm thinking of questionnaire software because we've had a recent challenge with this, doing a qualitative questionnaire. Even if your institution has a license, so for example, Swansea University has a Qualtrics license, or at least bits of it do. I'm not quite sure how it's organised, but they only have one level of Qualtrics license. And there are many different levels. We don't have the premium one. So, for example, I wanted to incorporate images in a qualitative questionnaire to get responses to those images, but I couldn't do it in the version of the software that Swansea has. So it requires a little bit of exploration here. And when you're doing anything, that needs to not only be what do I have access to, but how long will I have access to it for? What is the licensing arrangement? How long is it guaranteed? And what will happen if you're a student or indeed a member of staff, if you leave the institution, what will happen to the data and how will you get access to it? So that is really important to think about. And obviously research databases, by which I'm meaning things like Scopus and all those sorts of things that you can look at if you're doing some form of literature review or a systematic literature review, either within your particular study, or sometimes that might be the whole purpose of the study. So if I'd been thinking about this a bit more when I was drawing my pyramid and had a bit more PowerPoint skills, I'd have probably put lots of little arrows between these levels to say that it's always think about how you're going to integrate what you're doing and what the potential barriers are for doing that. The more sophisticated you get with the tools and technology, just bear in mind, potentially the more barriers you are creating in terms of the way in which you might want to move your data around either now or in the future. So it is really important to future-proof yourself. I was still writing papers on my PhD research. Let me just try and think. Some 5 years after I'd finished my PhD and needing access to my actual data. So I had to think quite carefully about how I was doing that and what I was exporting at what stage, and how I was going to carry on doing that once I didn't have access to NVivo anymore. What else did I want to say on here? I think that's just as I've already said a couple of times, most of the qualitative software that is out there, whether we're talking about transcription or analysis, is really focused on this idea that you have a meet somebody, talk to them, record it, transcribe it, and then analyze. That is the production process you are going through. That isn't to say that they're not more flexible than that. They are. As I say, I used NVivo during an ethnography. So I was using it for recording daily field notes and that sort of stuff as well. And I have also used it with, they do a particular add-on to download social media data, which I'll talk a bit more about later on. But I think it's important to recognise that most of the software started and is best at this sort of, interview, transcribe, analyze approach. If you are doing something that doesn't fit that norm, what you can find yourself is being a bit constrained. So it's just important to bear that in mind. Okay, so that's the general overview. So let's talk about qualitative recording. For those of you that don't know, this is a picture of tape. When I started my master's, I had a little tape recorder. I should have got them out. I've got them in a cupboard. I had a little tape recorder that took these little Olympus tapes, and each one I think recorded 90 minutes. And you literally, like any old tape recorder, put it in, press the button, a big red light came on, and you could see the tape moving, right? Which in one sense was fabulous because it's really reassuring. And if any of you have done recording with any other sort of digital device, you will know that even if there's a little red light, it's still a bit unnerving sometimes that you can't actually. But with a tape, you could see. Oh, sorry, I was moving my mouse on it. You could see the little wheels going round, and that was fabulous. Except the one time the record button got pressed in my bag and broke the tape, and therefore I lost an interview. So that was very distressing. But most of the tools that we have started working on, and particularly pre-pandemic, there was this assumption that you would need some sort of device to record someone on, and therefore you then needed a process for accessing that device. Essentially, we've now moved on from this idea, although I would still recommend you have a look if you're doing recording at, particularly in-person recording, at a digital a dictaphone. I think I've got 3 at the moment of varying degrees, and just make sure that you understand particularly how that works with your chosen PC, particularly if you're using a Mac versus if you're using a Windows machine, because there are often issues of compatibility that you might need to bear in mind. That is also true for software, although most of the software that I'm going to talk about is available. In fact, everything I'm talking about, because I work on a Mac, is available for both Windows and Mac, but there are some differences that I'll point out as we go. And so generally what we are looking at is having some sort of device that we might want to record on, and then a process that means that we can access that. Now, I would still recommend that there are some real benefits to a standalone digital recorder. And this sort of starts the discussion, I guess, that we'll get onto in more detail about the issues of using the cloud, issues of who has access to what, and the extent to which recordings are secure. Your recording is your most your participants at their most exposed. If someone were to hear your recording, it would not be anonymized. It would not be, it wouldn't be confidential. You would be able to identify the speaker. There would be all sorts of things. So really, you have to start to think about your security right from the minute that you press record on a device, and therefore how you or what device you are using to record is really important. A main issue that has been, sorry, just put it in the chat. Okay, sorry. Yes, Sarah's just recommending Mendeley, which do have a look, but the Mendeley app, I think, was discontinued recently, so you've only got the online version, but we can come back to that one. So a main challenge has been the cost of professional transcription to get from recordings. Roughly used to roughly guess at about £1 a minute, but it has gone up. Although we're now starting to see the prices of professional transcription flatline and indeed come down a little bit because of the options that there are out there that I'll talk about in a minute in terms of technology to do that for you. And the time, if you have ever tried to transcribe anything, and I tried with the old tape thing, I mean, it used to take me over a day, maybe 2 days to transcribe an interview, literally sort of press play, and I can touch type, or you had to buy some very complicated foot pedal tool to do the stop start, which certainly no one I knew ever did. Professional transcription, if you have funding, and particularly if you have time limited funding, and there may be a particular period where you're not going to spend it on training or something else, rather than letting that money go to waste, getting some transcription done can be really useful, particularly if you just want to get through it. A professional transcription is generally going to be the most accurate option, but professional transcribers will depend on the transcription notation and the amount of detail they will put in. The more detail you want, surprise, surprise, the more expensive it is. And the more people you have involved, the more expensive it is. When I've used professional transcription, I've always had research funding for it. But for focus groups, just to come back to that point that was raised in the chat, it is one of the only reliable ways of getting speakers identified. And you can usually give a professional transcriber, particularly if you're recording a focus group, if you get people at the beginning to then introduce themselves and say their names, usually a professional transcriber is good enough then that they will be able to identify different speakers as they go through. I've had a go at doing it myself, and it is really tricky if you don't get someone to really clearly say their name so you can pick out the voices as you go through. Even if you think you're going to do it and remember it, it actually is much harder to do than you imagine. So particularly since the pandemic then, Zoom and Teams have really dramatically changed the way, both for us and for often, but not always for our participants, their way of understanding how things take place. And perhaps even more importantly, the way things may be retained. It's no longer unusual for a Zoom meeting to be recorded or a Teams meeting to be recorded. And generally, we are now quite accepting of that. It is really important, however, to think about your participants' experience of these sorts of systems. There's a bit of a bias when we look at qualitative research to assume that we're doing research in sort of office-based environments where this sort of technology is around all the time. and everybody's used to it. But it is something to think about and even talk to participants about during a pilot study. I know when I was doing my ethnography and I was carrying around my little dictaphone, which was smaller than a phone, and I used to have it on with me. It did get to the stage where I would be going to team meetings and they would quite often forget that it was there, or joke about the fact that what I was going to be doing with the recording. So even other devices can become sort of embedded in the research process, and people do tend to forget about them a bit. So recordings, you've got the chat, obviously the option of transcribing most recordings, and now we're even getting AI summaries. I don't know if this is something that any of you have come across, but we certainly have it now where members of staff are not attending meetings, but they have requested an AI summary of the meeting. So you get a little notification at the beginning of a Zoom meeting saying that an AI tool is recording for somebody. I wouldn't recommend that in research myself, but we're getting more used to that, and that they don't only have to be used in terms of doing something like we're doing today remotely. You can still use Zoom and Teams in a face-to-face scenario for recording, either on your phone or on a laptop. So they can be used as a handheld sort of voice recording option for you. And remotely, obviously, the real advantage is participant recruitment. In fact, even if you're not having to travel that far, studies where I've done where you end up, I did some work with railway engineers, even in quite a constrained geographical area, I still couldn't really do more than 2, maybe 3 interviews in a day because of the travel involved and having to allow the time in case, ironically, the trains were running late, etc. So do think about that. The big caveat I would put on that is there is an alternative then temptation to cram as many interviews in a day as you possibly can because you can if you're doing them remotely. But ordinarily, the amount of energy and effort, etc., that an interview might involve, I would always say, firstly, you have to make sure that you have left enough time for the participant. The last thing you want to be doing is rushing someone because you've got someone else to go and see, because that doesn't make them feel very important. And secondly, you need time yourself to reflect on an interview and to decompress and prepare for the next one. Depends slightly what sort of topics you're talking about, but in general, you don't want to be backing up and assuming that, oh, I've got 8 hours today, I'll cram 8 interviews in it. I would say if you're doing 4 interviews a day, you're probably going to find that quite full on. Very different if you're in an ethnographic situation and you have a full day, then obviously that's slightly different. You're on in a different way in terms of a participant observation during that period anyway. So yes, do think about things like Zoom and Teams, how you can use them in face-to-face scenarios as well as remotely. Often if we're doing what we are finding with organisations is that preference for Teams over Zoom, but with individuals, a preference for Zoom over Teams. So if we're working with an organisation, they will have a preference for one over the other. So again, that's something to bear in mind. There's also this issue about what's called felt anonymity, which is that there is some discussion amongst researchers that Zoom and Teams offer some potential for people to feel less visible, not least because they can control the camera and that they can put a backdrop up, they can hide their surroundings. There's potential for them to do interviews in their own homes. So that is something to bear in mind. We would never, or I would never, as a PhD supervisor, for example, suggest that you went to interview someone in their own home. From a researcher safety perspective, that is obviously something that we wouldn't recommend. We would nearly always say meet in a workplace or a public space. But public spaces can be tricky. If anyone's ever tried to record anything in a cafe, you will know that the background noise is nearly always much more than you anticipate or that you hear yourself. And then on a recording, it can become incredibly difficult, and you nearly always have to transcribe those yourself. So, it does open up perhaps some potential for access. So there are some buts. Not all participants are familiar or comfortable with Teams and Zoom. This also applies for recording devices, right? So it is, I've certainly had interviews using recording devices where people have asked me to stop them, which obviously is fine. From an informed consent perspective, you must always give a participant the option of pausing or stopping a recording, however you are doing it. And so that can impact recruitment or interactions in an interview. I've not found this too problematic. In fact, I would say I've probably found people across different areas more comfortable, as I say, on Teams and Zoom. The ethics, particularly of voice and video, and how you store these recordings if you're using a standalone device. I've only got my phone to wave around here now, or something that is contained. Obviously, you are in complete control of that recording. There's always that slight moment where you're terrified that you might have recorded over it before you've uploaded it, or any of those things. But you have control over it. With Teams and Zoom, obviously, those are that you need to think about where those recordings are stored, and the potential to have a video recording that you may not need, that you may not have had, or if you've had permission for, you may only have permission to subsequently delete it straight away if you're not analysing it. So that's something very important to think about. At Swansea, for example, because we have secure storage via SharePoint, that would be where I would recommend my PhD students store all their recordings, bearing in mind, as I said earlier, that those are often the most risky in terms of anonymity, exactly. Inbuilt transcription, which there is, obviously, in Teams and Zoom, and we've all seen this, I'm guessing, is generally very poor quality. If there's any form of technical subject, and by technical, I mean specific to the topic, any form of language that is not, everyday lay terminology. If participants talk fast, it can be very difficult, or have any accent. Even my accent, Zoom struggles with. So it's not even a particularly strong accent. So then the amount of time that you're going to spend editing to make a transcript usable can be significant. It's not as long as doing it yourself from scratch, but those are the things to think about. But there, sorry, for some reason I went back. Okay, so talking then about transcription specifically, the thing that you have to think about is really what you actually are going to need. There is a temptation, particularly early in a research career, to think you have to transcribe everything from the first hello to the last I'm turning the recording off now moment, right? Very rarely will you need all of that work. So the first thing that you often need to think about is what of a recording do you actually need to transcribe? Particularly if you are paying a professional, it can be really important to say, please start at 3 minutes 11 and end at 45 minutes 17, because you're paying for every extra minute, right? That is recorded. Then you need to think about what sort of transcription you need for the analytic approach that you are using. You must know this before you start transcribing, because the risk is really that either you go too far in terms of perhaps a full detailed approach that you might use for something like conversation analysis, which would have all the pauses, all the overlaps, every and ah detailed, an incredibly detailed transcript according to the like full Jefferson notation, versus you're doing a thematic analysis and you're not really interested in overlapping speech or pauses, and you don't need any of that detail. So you do really need to understand the level that you are likely to need before you start. It's also worth thinking about what you can do with the recording itself. So for example, tools like NVivo will allow you to code the actual recording. You don't need a transcript to code in NVivo. You can play the recording and actually record aspects of that, to the extent that you can then decide what you transcribe at a later approach. And also thinking about the ethics requirements. A big issue I have with doing that with the voice recording is that you have not done any anonymity work. You've not anonymized anything till relatively late on in your process. Whereas for me, I would always be, the transcript would be the point at which I would use pseudonyms and look at confidentiality and anonymity confidentiality and anonymity in terms of things like changing company names, making sure that, when they are, as often happens in an interview, complaining about, I don't know, Joe, their manager, you've taken Joe's name out there very early on. So, that I would always do that sort of work on the first draft of a transcript. So if you are going to work with a voice recording, you have to really understand that you're going to have to do, you're carrying that risk, if you like, till further in the process. And as I've already mentioned about data storage and access. And there is this point that many of the qualitative research approaches will say that in doing transcription, you are helping get familiar with the data. That's really true if you have a period of time, particularly, it depends how your research is playing out. I often say that people assume that you do all your data collection and then you do your transcription and then you do your analysis. Very rarely does it work like that, because interviews might be all over the shop and you might have started, you might be doing interviewing, transcribing and a bit of analysis consecutive, at the same time over a period of months. So if you're doing that, then there is, I think, some added benefit in terms of being familiar with the data and also reflexively thinking about yourself. It's the only time you will really get to hear yourself as an interviewer if you are doing the transcription. So there are now lots of options for what I would call transcribing without transcribing. We've already talked about using inbuilt transcription through Zoom and Teams, but obviously there are lots of what I would call playback options, and that includes Zoom and Teams. So even if you had recorded something on a recorder, you can leave that to play into a new online meeting that you set up without any other participants on Zoom or Teams for transcription. But you can also use options like that in Microsoft Word. It does depend on your version of Word. So you would need to check that that is available for you. And those are, well, I think Word is relatively slightly better than perhaps doing it in Zoom or Teams. But they're still going to get you, I would say, a sort of, 60 to 70% transcription rate. None of these are necessarily going to get you that 100%. Then there are a host of new transcription apps. This is where I would probably should have put a few red flags on here. This is where I would say proceed with caution. Otter AI is one of the most popular apps, and they are becoming increasingly popular. I have heard researchers talking about using these apps with absolutely no discussion of any challenges involved at all, that they are incredibly helpful. And that is true. But I think there are some, as I put on the last bullet point on this set here, approach with maybe extreme is me being a little bit over the top. But my view and my personal approach is to approach with extreme caution. And I will come on to the fact that tools like NVivo are now adding AI apps within that software. So there are now integrations with some of these transcription apps and tools like NVivo, or they are building them in or as add-ons. Obviously, you have to pay more for them because that's how this works onto what is already expensive software. So journalists have been using these sorts of transcription apps for a long time. And there are some concerns emerging now by journalists saying that there have been issues of security, when it comes to people being able to identify their sources, for example, which gives me cause for concern. I would say the technology is moving much faster than researchers can review it. If journalists are only just catching up to it, then you can guess that academics are a little bit further behind. There are some GDPR, and then this depends which country you're in and where you are situated, but there are GDPR implications for transcription errors. So if an individual's personal data is inaccurately recorded, obviously this doesn't apply to just apps, it applies to anything, then you can be in breach of GDPR. All the cloud-based options incur some data security risks that you would need to assess. And I think there are real concerns about how free versions of these apps are able to be free and that they are potentially monetizing the data, so selling the data to feed AI engines. And that is where we have to be incredibly cautious, because there is nowhere on anyone's informed consent that I've ever seen where it says, do you mind if we just sell all your data on for AI or give it away for free? So, and I'm fairly sure most participants would say, no, I don't want to do that. So you do need to be careful. And certainly with Otter AI, where I've had a look at it, I have not been satisfied that I am comfortable for my research. And most of my research involves looking at the LGBTQIA plus community and their experiences at work. So I would say I am researching with what is a community where trust is of paramount importance, and trust with a researcher is really hard to build and quick to break. So I am not prepared to risk that. It may be that if the research topic is less sensitive, perhaps there may be more ability to use these sorts of tools. And I've already said that there's some issues on how AI is being built into the analysis software. I'll put the slides up on our Breaking Binaries blog. This is a paper that I quite usefully summarised quite a lot of the issues around digital transcription. And so this and a couple of other papers that you'll see at the end can be useful. There is actually one PhD student who has tested all sorts of different methods for the playback options of transcription and come up with sort of comparative timings, although when I looked in detail at it, I think pretty much it said at the end, they're all pretty similar. So I put that paper at the end as well. So as I say, some pros and cons to weigh up here. I should say that everything that I'm talking about here is looking at doing this in the English language. If you are also going to be translating as well as transcribing, that obviously is another layer of challenge that you need to consider. And there is quite a big literature on the pros and cons on how you translate research data, depending on whether the who's doing the research interview, whether it's and how the linguistic ability of the research team plays into that as well. But obviously, there are now many tools for translating, and those of us that are marking international students with work would say, be very careful, because we know that translation tools are not very accurate. And there is a lot of call for carrying on through data analysis, etc., in the original language of the interview, and only translating at the point at which you need particular data for publication. But as I say, that is a separate layer that you would need to consider. Okay, so very briefly, I just wanted to put, I think I've only got one slide or maybe two slides up on other forms of qualitative data. So I do quite a lot of visual research. And so this is something that I've looked at quite a lot. And obviously I also have looked at it for things like diaries and ethnography. What you will find is that you get very excited, or at least I got very excited recently when I was trying to look at some, back to this idea of doing images in a qualitative questionnaire. Lots of tools out there, often designed for market research or in-company research rather than academic research. And nearly everything I looked at was ridiculously expensive. It's just not built for the idea of one researcher wanting to go to talk to sort of 30 or 40 people. It's built for the large scale sort of, let's call it quick and dirty research, where you might want to show a couple of people a picture and capture a response. It's just not built for the same thing. And I didn't see anything that I found that was ethically robust enough. I have used, and I'll mention this a minute, NVivo to capture social media data. But generally, when I've used, I've stuck to fairly either using bog standard screenshotting, or using Word and PowerPoint and those sorts of things for downloading and collecting images. If you do want to look at visual research, I would say have a look at Richard Rogers' work in Amsterdam. He has a big visual lab where they've used all sorts of technology. There are all sorts of things you can do with sort of sentiment analysis and all sorts of clever things around visual data if you want to do it. But I sort of just putting this here as a bit of a bookmark, because I think it's a slightly different discussion, and is a bit of a specialist area. Yes, so just basically try and find someone who's used it before, is my advice if you're going into any of these less common tools, particularly in an academic setting, and always do a pilot test. Many years ago, did a whole load of research collecting data from using Google Alerts to find data on the internet around in different news sources around a topic, and came up with quite a complicated way of collecting it, only to discover that when I imported it into NVivo, all my very clever way of tagging the data all disappeared, because NVivo didn't like the way I'd structured it. So that was quite a painful process. I had to undo what I'd done. So do always do a pilot test, particularly if you're capturing different forms of data. Okay. Oh, sorry, jumped forward a slide. So let's get to talking about qualitative analysis. So computer-aided qualitative data analysis software, or now often just called QDAS, has been around for a very long time. And there are lots of different tools. I have only used NVivo seriously. I have used Atlas TI, but only at a training course. So I think they are there are pros and cons, and you will find communities, and it's worth finding your community who are strongly in favour of one or the other. I tend to find that what happens now is it depends on your institutional license. So for example, at Swansea, we have access to NVivo. So, if you've got access to an institutional license, that will make a big difference. And quite frankly, it's not very unlikely to be worth the cost of looking around. However, with that institutional license, as I mentioned earlier, do make sure you know which version you have access to and what additional options that gives you. I have found, and most of you are doing doctoral research, so you don't have as much of a collaboration issue as you might do later on, but I have certainly found trying to collaborate with researchers at other institutions using NVivo incredibly problematic, because institutions, because of the cost, do not always, in fact, they very rarely upgrade to the latest version as and when it's out. And NVivo is particularly bad at allowing backward and forward movements of data sets through versions. You can move forward, but you cannot move back. So if you end up working, as I did a few years ago, working with a researcher as another institution where I think they had version 10 and I had version 9. I now can't remember. They did some work in version 10 and then I could no longer access the data set. So do bear that in mind when you have a look. I'm hoping that has actually improved in recent years. So a lot of what these offer is the same. They all offer some form of coding, query, and mapping tools. That sort of basic things that you can do on them. And then there are, so for example, NVivo at an extra cost will now has AI transcription and auto coding options within it. So I think this is part of this change in terminology from computer aided qualitative data analysis software to just calling it qualitative data analysis software. And there's quite a divide in the research community about this. So I think I am very much of the software does not do the analysis for you. And if I am reviewing a paper and it says I did the analysis using NVivo, I will always, in my review, point out that I would like to know what analysis they actually did, because the technology does not do the analysis for you. Now, with some of the AI options, it's potentially offering you that sort of, that as an outcome. So I quite like this quote, this idea about the software being an environment in which you work. It's a tool set that you can use. It does not do the analysis for you in the same way that I would say coding is not analysis. But it can also provide lots of other functions. So, a place to store your data. One of the advantages is because of the way that NVivo works, you will always have your clean original transcript to go back to. Sometimes if you're working in Word or other tools, you have to be careful to make sure that you keep your clean original transcript to go back to. And there are ways of making connections and moving around NVivo and searching and pulling reports that are very attractive. But it doesn't actually do the analysis. And it can be very expensive. Really important for PhD students that you think about how you will access what you've done subsequently once you don't have institutional access anymore. So the advantages, let's sort of walk through these. A very secure, usually, single repository for your research data. You are never going to have to worry about having multiple files and multiple backups and all that sort of thing. You will always have one file for all your research data that you can easily back up. I think the basic functions are usually quick and very easy to learn. Coding, for example, is not difficult to learn. to do in NVivo. It is easy to get to started, and once you're started, it's really easy to get through the material quite quickly. As I've already said, you've got your original data is always clean and there for you to go back to, as are various stages through the process. It's great at having an audit trail, so that you can really easily see what you've done when and how your, for example, coding structure has changed, how you've thought about themes, if that's where you're going. And it's really great with large data sets. You can accommodate different data types. So, for example, there is an add-on that you can get in NVivo that allows you to capture social media data. I will say that when I used it, it crashed every fourth time I used it. So it became a ridiculously long and complicated process that I subsequently abandoned, because it would work for 2 or 3 captures, and then it's called NCapture, the add-on, and then it would crash and I'd have to come out of NVivo, restart it and do it again. So I gave up with it and went back to screenshotting for a while. And you can use some, I think one of the really important things about this is you don't have to use everything in NVivo. So you can use some features of it and then back out of it and do other things either manually or with other sorts of software. I think people tend to feel a bit like if they're in, they're in, and you have to use all the tools to ensure you're getting value for it. And I would urge some caution on that. When I was doing my PhD, because I had loads of complicated data from lots of different people in one organization, I got very excited about the fact that I could code, I could set up participant codes. So I could identify where the same person had been in a meeting and an interview and a report, and I could look at the data from an individual person perspective. And I thought this was fabulous. And I went away and I did quite a lot of work to do all that. And then I never used it at all. Because it wasn't telling me a story that was very helpful with regard to my research questions. And I think that is the key, is that you do have to use it, let's use the word mindfully or carefully or thoughtfully, so that you are actually focused on your research questions. But things like built-in backups, and if you've got institutional access to something like NVivo, you could just use it as a data repository. You wouldn't have to use any of the analytic tools at all. It could just be the place you store your data and how it's backed up. Okay, so it can be useful for those sort of uses, even if you're not going to use its full analysis software tools. So then the disadvantages. So all of these tools have in mind a way or ways in which analysis plays out. And mostly, so for example, NVivo was built on the original approaches, the sort of Strauss and Corbin approaches to grounded theory. And so if you're not taking a grounded theory approach, then you do have to think quite carefully about how you are going to adapt or use the tool for your own approach. I've used it for narrative analysis, discourse analysis, but you do have to be very careful and think about how you're going to use the tool to support different methods. And there are some people, particularly discourse analysts, who will say you can't use, or do say you can't use software to do that sort of analysis. So you have to find your way through it a little bit more carefully. It is very easy to get distracted by the tools. I've seen this. I've seen conference presentations where people have put up network maps of codes. And that's very pretty and sort of interesting, but it doesn't answer their research question. And so you can end up spending too little time on actual analysis of the data. While some of the tools early are the sort of base coding and sorting and searching are very easy, the more advanced tools do need more time to use them effectively. So it's important to build that in. I've mentioned cost and reliability. On the whole, these are fairly reliable. I think my experiences with the add-on of NCapture probably have left me a little jaded in terms of reliability, but I would say that the competition is such that you do find that the newer releases, some of the tools are often a little unstable. A big critique is that it increases the distance between the researcher and the participants, that you can feel like your data has become very removed from the original context in which you collected it. One of the ways around this that I found was I still had printouts of everything, and I would still listen to my recordings as I was doing my analysis or at various points during the analysis. But I think you can become a little bit distant, particularly if you get over zealous with your coding and you end up working in sort of with lots of code structures that lose the individual story or lose the individual narrative completely. It is difficult. There is limited portability. You can extract some reports to use in other programs, and I have quite successfully taken a code structure from NVivo and used it then for a more detailed analysis that I actually did in Word, where I was doing narrative analysis, and I didn't feel comfortable doing it in NVivo. But that is something that you need to sort of bear in mind. I've already talked about collaboration. It might limit your flexible working if the machines on which you have access to the software are only on campus. And that there is this thing about once you've invested time to learn it, you do feel a little obliged to use it. Because it's like anything where you invest time, you think, well, I must now make it count. And it's quite hard to back out of using NVivo. And I've talked about the long-term access implications. So some of you will be familiar with this book. This is Brown and Clark's thematic analysis, most recent book. It's not a very clear picture. But I remember chatting to Ginny about their real decision to put a picture, and I can't remember whether this is Ginny or Victoria are on the cover, but it's one of them, doing coding manually because they, sorry, my dog started barking in the background, because they felt it was really important to emphasize that they feel that there is a very strong connection between the individual researcher and the analysis. So they talk about analysis being a process of mind, being a thoughtful process. It is our active cognitive engagement with the data. It is not something that you can do just in the tool itself, and that you have to be careful with this idea that the qualitative software presents this very idea that it's an instrumental process, and also what they call this realist extractive model. That is to say that the answer is hiding in your data, and that you just need to manipulate it correctly and it will emerge. Those of you that have read a lot of Broad and Clark's work will know that they are very against using the word emerge, because it negates this idea of the active intellectual involvement that we have with our data, and that our analysis is a very personal and subjective engaged process. And that they suggest that using software is or can be at odds with this deep questioning and engagement. Now, you can facilitate this idea of deep questioning and engagement with using software tools, but you're in a sense sort of fighting against the software sometimes to do that. So you have to very actively work out how you will build that in. So I built in a process when I was doing discourse analysis using NVivo of memoing. So very carefully creating, because you can create documents that live with your transcription, of creating very detailed analysis documents that lived with my transcripts, that were my notes and thoughts about the data, my sort of analytic processes, if you like. But I could have done that in Word. I didn't have to do, I mean, I could have done it on hand, I could have done it handwritten. I didn't have to do that in NVivo. So I also wanted just to highlight, and there is another, I've done another recording on this free macro, which is what I've been using lately, which is simply a way of doing coding that allows you to, sort of a low-tech way, allows you to literally do your coding in comment boxes in Word and then extracts all that into an Excel spreadsheet. The downside of it is you don't have any, you have to keep it, if you want to use a standard code set, you have to keep a list of that, because it's not selecting a code in the same way that something like NVivo will let you do once you've created them. So you do need to do quite a bit of cleaning up. But the plus that I have found is that it keeps a very clear track record, an audit trail, and allows you to see across the way it does the Excel spreadsheet. It keeps your data and your coding together, and it situates it in a document and a date and a time, and you still have your original transcript left for you. Whereas if you've ever tried cutting and pasting a transcript into tables or something like that, it becomes very messy because you can't always keep the original. You don't have very good audit trail through that process. It is a bit complicated in that you can only use it on Windows. You can only use the extract process on Windows. You can do the coding on any machine. So I tend to code on my Mac, and then I take it into the office where I've got a Windows desktop and I run the macro to do the extraction that way. But as I say, there is another, and when I post this video on the blog, I will put a link to where you can see this. This is something that I discovered through Braun and Clark's own thematic analysis website. They suggest this as a useful sort of low-tech means of doing the analysis. So what next? What I suggest that do your research, think about what's suitable for your particular project, talk to as many people as you can who've used different tools, go on a training course. If you're new to qualitative research and you've not done an NVivo or an Atlas TI training course, particularly if you've got a training budget, never going to do you any harm. It's not going to do any harm to learn how to do these things, particularly if you might be ending up in a postdoc role or a research assistant role where they're looking for skills in this area. So, having it as a tick in your skill set, even if you decide not to use it, is not necessarily, it's not going to do you any harm. At all possible, try it out with pilot data, or get someone to show you with your data. Most of the tools have sort of class sets that you can work with, but it's not usually I have never found that very helpful. I've found using my own data the only way really to get a sense of it. Don't feel pressured into using a particular tool just because it's there or because other people are using it. You will need to sort of think about what the justification is. So once you've made a decision, and in fact, this applies whether you're using a tool or not, do develop a research protocol. So very clearly understand what steps are you going to take in your analysis and your transcription, and how are you managing that process? Excuse me. And make sure that that protocol works with your chosen methodology. So if you're doing narrative analysis and you know what form of narrative your analysis you're doing, how do you translate that into something that will work with your tool? And have a very clear process for reviewing that. There is nothing more heartbreaking than sitting in a PhD supervision with someone who has finished their analysis and discovering that for whatever reason it's gone down a slightly odd track and you need to reel it back and perhaps revisit some of it. Now, analysis is inevitably iterative. It's never a straightforward A to B or A to Z path. There's always a lot of iteration involved. But that requires a really active review process, particularly if you're a doctoral researcher with your supervision team, about saying, well, this is where I am in relation to my research questions, and this is what I want to try next, and what do you think, and how might I try that next step in terms of the analysis. So I think this just sort of reaffirms the point I made earlier about making sure that that you're reading a lot about research and that you're thinking carefully about methods, not assuming that it will just happen. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say. I'm going to stop sharing. Sorry, just say this is the reference list that I'll put up at the end, up on the slide. So they're from various sources, and this is often the way with methodology, particularly new methodologies. You'll find that they aren't always in the same sort of journals that you would generally look, although there are quite a lot in the qualitative research journals. But hopefully these will be useful. And as I say, I've also put a link up to this is the NCRM, it's National Centre for Research Methods, their new document on digital ethics, which starts to get into issues of AI. And then there's also the SAGE, have a research methods community, and they've got a recent blog on qualitative data analysis software. So that actually took me longer to talk through than I thought it would. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Yes, do just unmute and ask me.
Okay, hi Katrina. Thank you so much for sharing. I think a lot of what you said resonates with where I am now, especially in conducting my interviews, transcribing them, familiarizing myself with the data. But my first question is around the ethics of like sharing transcripts with professional transcribers. I am working with very sensitive data. I'm researching on the integration experiences of forcibly displaced migrant women. I don't plan to give anybody any of my transcripts to help with that, but I'm wondering, what are the ethical issues around this and what would you advise? Then, secondly, I am a culprit of mentioning that I use qualitative research I use software to do my research. Now, am I correct to rephrase this to say, I analyze the data with the support or the assistance of XYZ, a qualitative data analysis software? Then lastly, sorry.
Can I stop and do those two? Otherwise I might forget. Yeah. Is that all right?
Thank you.
So I'm just going to take the second one first because I think it's easier. So yes, you are correct in saying that. What I would want to see is to say that you have used the tool to support your analysis, but I would still, if I was reviewing a paper, for example, or reading a PhD, examining a PhD, I'd still want to know, what did you actually do? What was the analysis that you did? So I'd still expect you to explain your analytic steps. And then on the first one, so firstly, in applying for ethics, you should also always be clear how you're going to transcribe your data. So you need to make decisions about transcription at the start of the process. So your ethics, your institutional ethics approval should include approval for using a professional transcriber And that professional transcriber normally has to be one that is known to the university and that has guarantees about confidentiality, anonymity, how you share files, etc., etc. So I have 2 or 3 that I would use because I know they are trusted professional transcribers. It's not the same as saying Joe down the road is going to type them up for me. You know, you have to have someone who has the necessary safeguards in place to deal with that data. I quite often use people who also work with the NHS, you know, who are used to dealing with sensitive data. So that would something that you'd always put in your ethics submission, and you would also be clear with your participants who you were sharing your data with. So normally you would say with your research collaborators, so that might include supervisors, and a transcriber if you are using one. And also, obviously, as part of that informed consent, you would be making it clear that anonymized extracts from their data would be used in presentations and publications, etc. So that's very much how you would need to build it all into the informed consent process. Does that answer those 2 questions?
Yes, it does. I'm just wondering, sorry, I'm talking too much, but just to clarify, do the transcribers need to sign a confidentiality clause?
So usually that will be part of the contractual arrangement with the transcription company. So if you are sending a file, there would normally be an agreement about how you usually pay more to have it transcribed quickly. So if you want it back in 3 days, there's a higher rate. And so part of that will all be the contractual arrangement that you have with the transcriber, that they will only keep a file until the transcription is received. They will delete the files after so many days. All those sorts of things will be part of your contract with that professional transcriber. If they're not able to offer that level of detail, then you just wouldn't use them.
Okay, thank you. Then my very last question, I'll be quick about it, sorry. Sometimes I like exploring with word clouds on Envivo, and usually when I clean up my transcripts, I put in the interviewer, interviewee, titles, etc. And I realized that when I run the query for the word clouds, the word interviewer, interviewee comes up. Please, do you have any advice on how I can overcome that? Thank you.
I don't use word clouds because I don't actually. I mean, if you're doing content analysis, then obviously you would then just remove those words from your search terms, from the way in which you're doing content analysis. But essentially a word cloud is a summary of a content analysis. So it would depend if I wanted to do content analysis or not. And then I'd probably be looking at very careful querying of which terms I wanted to include in my content analysis and why. So there'd be a protocol for it, rather than just using a word cloud. Now, that's not to say I might not use a word cloud in a conference presentation or something just because it's pretty, but it wouldn't be an analytic, it's not an analytic tool that I would use.
Thank you very much. Sorry for taking your
That's all right. I'm sure other people found those questions useful, particularly about transcription. It is really important to make sure that you get those terms and conditions clear, and that you're always clear with your participants who will see your transcripts, and to include your supervisory team in that if you want to talk those through with them. But I would never, by the way, expect you to include a transcript in a thesis ever, because you would very rarely have permission to do that. And obviously the way that theses are then published, etc., don't ever put a full transcript in the back. You might put some extracts in to show your interview technique in your methodology chapter, but you wouldn't really ever include a transcript, not that I have seen anyway, or requested. Any other questions? We've got a little bit more time left. Or have I just bombarded you all with too much information? It's very quiet.
Katrina, can I just ask a question if there is anybody here from Queen Mary University, because I know you extended the invitation out to PhD students there. I'm not sure that there is, but is there anybody here from Cred at Queen Mary?
I don't know. The invite also went out to all Swansea, so there will be people here that you don't recognise, I imagine.
That's right.
I mean, is that because they have different access to different software?
Oh, no, it was just because I wanted to say hello to them. I wanted to see if the invitation had that.
Okay, no, that's fine.
Similar. I think at Queen Mary, they are given access to NVivo, but it's very clunky with their system. It actually works better here at Swansea than at Queen Mary, I found.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a good point as well, in terms of, particularly if you're using it, depending on what machine you're using it on, will have a will have a big impact in terms of how usable it is. And as I say, the key for me is understanding what will happen when you finish your PhD in terms of having access to the software. If you've got all your analysis on NVivo, you're either going to have to buy your own version or assume you're going to have access to a version in a later academic job or another role, because you can't afford to lose access to it.
Yeah, so for me, I have been able to transfer that over from Queen Mary, so it works now. I can access all my PhD research that I did at Queen Mary via the Swansea University login.
Okay, thank you very much, Kirsty, for your comment about transcription. I mean, I think on using the transcription tools, I mean, we're for all sorts of things. AI is obviously the direction of travel, and I have been involved in discussions on, or somebody had a discussion on, I think it was on Twitter or Blue Sky, saying, "Oh, what does everyone think about putting a transcript into ChatGPT and seeing how it analyzes it?" And I was just like flabbergasted that anyone would think ethically that you could put data just into ChatGPT, because obviously once you have put a query in like that into ChatGPT, you have given the data. The data is public. So, you know, I think undoubtedly people will be doing it, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I think it's the right thing to do. Any other questions, comments, thoughts? All right, well, I'm going to